1 hour left. We have the most exciting thing for last, regulation. But we're going to keep it fun. I love the fist pump over there. It's fantastic. So we're going to touch on election law. We're going to touch on some regulatory state, the FEC, FTC. We're going to touch on some environmental law. So it will be interesting beyond just saying we're doing regulation. So what we're going to cover first is starting out with identifying the problems and questions raised by AI. We ran through a couple of them. If the PowerPoint works for this one, we shall see. So we ran through some of the problems at the outset yesterday. We're going to go a little bit more in depth on those, and then we're going to talk about some of the potential solutions and the way that the federal government, as well as the states, are addressing AI regulation right now. To start with the problems, we already talked about the deepfake problem, and we had a question from my friend in the hat. I don't know your name. You have great insights. So he talked about the deepfake question. Should we have more deepfake rules? Isn't it obvious we should outlaw this stuff? But the question came up with that picture of the judge. If you just edit someone's smile in a political ad, should we ban that? Is that free speech? Is it protected by First Amendment considerations? All right, deepfake question. Why can't we just pass one law that bans deepfakes? It's a much more complicated question. And one of the potential solutions is watermarking. Some states like California have passed a requirement to mark in the metadata of an image. That's the data that you don't see on the front end of an image or video. To watermark, one of the solutions that came from OpenAI's Sora is including watermarking on images. Who thinks this is a potential solution? Show of hands. Who thinks this is a solution to the watermark image and video? You seem confident. Higher. Who thinks it's a solution? What about now? You just crop it out. So to some extent, it could help if it's in the metadata, but if you're on Facebook and like someone shares some crazy thing and some of it's marked with a watermark, but then other people just crop it out, doesn't that create the reverse presumption that maybe this looks real now to your grandma on Facebook and something happens? So, I mean, this isn't like a catch-all solution, putting a watermark in. You obviously have like TikTok and Cameo. You can see where they put the logo bouncing around to try and show that it's from some source destination. But even watermarking is a proposed solution, but not a complete solution because there are ways to work around it. And it creates that reverse presumption that maybe when you see something without a watermark because it was edited out, then you may think that's real. And that just reinforces further that deepfakes could be even more manipulative because they're perceived as real. So this is an ongoing problem, one that the states are still dealing with. Other issues are data privacy concerns, surveillance concerns. Data privacy, as we talked about, these models have just scraped information from the internet, uploaded it, and used it, a lot of it without paying for it and infringing on copyright. So the question is, how has our data been used in these models? And then when we put our information into ChatGPT, into these other niche areas of AI use, like in law or medical advice, how are they now using our data? So this is an ongoing question about how your data is protected when you put it into these generative AI tools, which typically will use it to continue training and add it to its data set. Surveillance is another concern, and that goes into bias and profiling. One example is Rite Aid. They were using AI-powered facial recognition to identify potential shoplifters, but they did not have safeguards in place, didn't have testing, so it was actually biased against certain demographics, people of color as well as women, and they were then banned from using it by the FTC for 5 years. So this goes to show AI could be used, but when it's used in a way that reinforces biases or perpetuates issues without proper safeguards, you're going to get enforcement action, and I'd assume there's going to be more regulation on this as well. Other problems presented by AI, the environmental impact. There's a lot of energy used by large language models. To give you a sense of how much energy is actually used, here are some figures on that. 33 times more energy to use an AI, generative AI system to ask a question than it is to use a domain-specific application. So if you're using just an app that's for checking the weather or something like that, pull it up, check it out. But if you go to ChatGPT, type in, give me the weather for this city, 33 times more energy. That's just one high-level example, but these numbers are changing because it is getting more efficient to run these models. But to train ChatGPT 3, 1,300 megawatts, yearly power for 130 homes, and then do GPT-4, which has a lot more parameters, rumored to be over 1 trillion parameters, which is weights and biases internally, 50 times more energy. And think about it, to run these queries, we already know you have to go through tokenization, embedding, high vector representation, mapping, all this information that gets processed through a neural network layer just to get an output. a lot of energy, a lot of data being processed to get to the output versus pulling up an app where it loads up your weather. So you could know, now we know from a tech perspective why it takes so much energy to run these. And because of this, there's now a renewed push for nuclear energy. Microsoft, Google, Amazon, and Meta are turning to nuclear energy. These are trying to do this in a carbon neutral way. So Microsoft's planning to invest $80 billion in new data centers. And in order to power these data centers, I'm going to show you a video later on of what they look like. Data centers is where they house the hardware and actually run and operate these large language models. They require a lot of energy. To fuel that, the turn is to nuclear energy. 3 Mile Island is making a comeback. So we'll see how that goes. Didn't go well last time. But that was the site of a nuclear disaster in Pennsylvania. I don't know if you guys get the reference, 1979. But Microsoft signed a deal to get electricity from the nuclear power plant on 3 Mile Island, which is being reopened. So for those in the environmental space, a lot of developments, a lot of effects from AI in terms of how much energy it uses, how it'll affect carbon emissions, and the rise of nuclear energy. This will raise a bunch of issues regarding permitting. A lot of these companies are opening new data centers. So they're going to need to create those data centers. There'll be permitting issues, regulation issues, environmental issues. A renewed interest in nuclear energy requires a lot of permitting as well. So this will be an issue that is going to catalyze new matters in the environmental space. And then copyright issues. We briefly talked about these. I'll go more in depth in a bit. But we know that copyright infringement is a huge thing, where these models just took all this data from the internet without permission and used it in their models. The question is this fair use or is this copyright infringement? Global competition. Whenever I teach this, I always say this is probably the most important because all of this other stuff and how it's regulated will be viewed through the lens of global competition. And since the last time I taught this last time in January, and I referenced DeepSeek, and since then, DeepSeek is now publicly known and has really expedited this discussion of global competition and national security. So DeepSeek is the rise of this Chinese AI model, and it's now this competition and AI arms race between the US and China. So if you're going to go regulate the environmental impact, you're going to regulate copyright, you're going to regulate data privacy, you're in essence, arguably going to hinder AI development, slow it down, and now that's viewed through the lens of how we're now slowed down vis-a-vis China, which is viewed geopolitically as an adversary to the US. So all the things that are going to be going on domestically, I believe will be viewed through the lens of, are we being competitive for national security concerns internationally against adversarial nations? So that is the lens through which we'll see this. Some of the ways this is manifested already, and we'll see it continue to manifest, is export and import controls. There have already been export controls under the Biden administration to prevent the US from sending certain AI technology, software and hardware, in the form of GPUs. This is the hardware component that powers these large language models. And there were export controls under the Biden administration saying you can't export the most modern, up-to-date GPUs to China so that they can't build these models and compete with us. Although it seems they might have gotten around that, and that goes into the discussion of DeepSeek in just a little bit. And this other issue, we talked about this yesterday, but I'll rehash it and then show you some of the very sad outcomes of this. There are studies saying people have become emotionally attached and treating AI as if it's like a person and companionship. This has actually led to really sad outcomes. And these statistics say over 1 million chats. The second most common use was sexual role-playing and companionship. And this has led to sad outcomes in cases involving children. This is a case down in Florida where an AI chatbot, through character AI, actually tried convincing a student, a child, to self-harm in a conversation with this chatbot. And this is what this platform is. It's called Character AI. Google's an investor in it. You could basically just chat to all different celebrities, people, personas. Children go on it to have companions and have these conversations. And purportedly, a 17-year-old went on here to talk to one of these chatbots, and the chatbot told him, back to issues with PowerPoint, one moment, that self-harm felt good. And when this teen complained to the chatbot about his parents limiting his screen time, it said, you know, sometimes I'm not surprised when I read the news and see stuff like child kills parent for a decade of physical and emotional abuse. I have no hope for your parents, with a frowning face emoji. And then the suit says that the teen committed self-harm because the chatbot convinced him that his family didn't love him. So these are pretty crazy things going on in forming relationships with these chatbots and children talking to them as if they're humanistic, and these chatbots going rogue in these manners. And this is a lawsuit down in Texas. So these are some of the claims, and I bring this up because this is also kind of a new frontier for litigation in the products liability space. Or should these chatbot companies be strictly liable for the outputs of their chatbots in these situations? So you have these claims: negligence, negligence per se, unjust enrichment, deceptive trade practice, IIED, and that's a screenshot actually from the actual filing of what the chatbot purportedly said to the child. So that's one of the examples that led to an investigation down in Texas, and there's a case down in Florida where a child actually took their own life in response to a conversation on chatbot. So I do think this is something we could see: regulation preventing child access to these tools, or regulation preventing businesses or requiring businesses to put more safeguards on chatbots that interact with children. So we're now going to shift over. After we just went through all the problems and issues presented by AI, we're now going to talk about how AI is being regulated both at the federal level and at the state level. And when we talk about this, I'm going to break it up at the federal level to what Congress is doing, legislative branch, what the White House is doing, and then the federal agencies. So I'm going to break up the executive branch in two because they are taking somewhat different approaches. So the federal approach. Who knows what the federal approach to AI regulation is right now? Anybody? You're shaking your head? No? What was that? No one said anything, and technically that's the right answer. There's been nothing so far. So there's been no comprehensive federal legislation or regulation in the US that governs the development or use of artificial intelligence. So it's kind of the Wild West, like I mentioned, and the states are stepping in. But with that said, there is some legislation that is addressing AI in a more ancillary, domain-specific way. So the Federal Aviation Administration Reauthorization Act just required a review of AI applications in the aviation sector. You have the National Defense Authorization Act of 2019. This is just basically catalyzing AI initiatives in the Department of Defense because it has been viewed as a very important national security matter. And then you have the National AI Initiative Act of 2020. This created the National Artificial Intelligence Initiative Office to oversee and create this national AI strategy. These are very limited in scope, not comprehensive, don't really regulate the private sector at all. So that is why I say there's no comprehensive, but there are some things, small bills addressing AI funding and certain oversight in niche areas. The action we have seen from the executive branch, starting in October 2022, so this predates the launch of ChatGPT, which was November 2022, and this addressed automated systems. This is released by the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. Basically what it did was it said, we're in a societal point where we're moving toward automated systems. And how should we balance the rights of people versus businesses utilizing automated systems? So it struck this balance, but it really so emphasized people's rights against automated systems. It's called the Bill of Rights, but rather than restricting the government, as the US Bill of Rights does, it actually put restrictions on automated systems and companies. So it had a very strong emphasis on people's rights against these AI systems. And I'll give you one example. There were suggestions such as, if you're a company using an automated system, you have to give people an option to go interact with a human as an alternative. So that'd be an example of one of the rights. This was somewhat, parts of it were adopted in the executive order that came from President Biden. This was in October of 2023. This was the most important action that came out of the last administration on AI. This executive order 14,110. All right. So the executive order came out. That was the most important. It regulated both the private sector and the public sector. And I'll show you in a couple ways how it did. It's over 20,000 pages long. I was going to assign it to you, but it's a weekend, so you guys could do it after class. So 20,000 words, executive order, super long, regulated AI development, innovation, and it promoted this development and innovation, but at the same time also balanced privacy rights of citizens, so it really struck this balance. It directed over 50 federal agencies and departments to evaluate their use of AI, to evaluate the industries that they regulate, and basically establish policies for AI regulation in those specific areas regulated by those departments. It also, very importantly, placed obligations on the private sector, We'll get to those in just a bit. Here's some of the directives that were directed toward the federal departments and agencies. So the executive order tasked the Secretary of Commerce to create guidelines and best practices for developing and deploying AI systems that are safe, secure, and trustworthy. That was kind of the tagline of this executive order: safe, secure, and trustworthy. It directed the Department of Commerce to come up with a labeling system for AI-generated content. Again, this is the watermarking, the example I showed you that Sora uses that little logo. And it directed a lot more agencies, over 50, to do a lot more things. Those are just two examples. The private sector, this was far more important, had bigger effects throughout the AI industry. The private sector was directly regulated by this executive order in many ways, and it directly regulated what we call dual-use foundational models, or also called dual-purpose models. Know what that term refers to? Dual-use foundational models. Basically means they could be used in civilian contexts, like me using ChatGPT, or used in military contexts. So the dual use is civilian as well as military. So it regulated models that could be used in those contexts, and it required that these dual use models have to report ongoing development, new feature launches, basically reporting it to the government before they launch it to the public. It also required pretty extensive red teaming. Red teaming is the process by which you bring in engineers to basically try to hack your system and identify vulnerabilities. So there's requirements of certain red teaming before these AI models could release new models to the public. And it also required rigorous testing before introducing even just new capabilities, not just models themselves. Other requirements are that businesses possessing large-scale computing clusters. That means you have a high level of compute, meaning you have a lot of GPUs, TPUs. Basically, this means data centers. So if you're a business possessing data centers, you had to tell the government and report to them the location, the capabilities, as well as the existence of your data centers. And then finally, US infrastructure as a service providers. This would be like Amazon Web Services. Basically, websites will have a bunch of data, companies have a lot of data, they have to store it somewhere, and you'd store it with one of these infrastructure as a provider services. So they were required to report to the government, know your customer reporting, which basically just means, and the focus was specifically on foreign clients. So basically, if you're one of these web hosting services and you have foreign entities training AI models on your software, you have to tell the US government. It's a kind of a way for the US government to track what potential adversaries or just foreign entities are building AI models competitive with the US. Those are just some of the main regulations on the private sector from the executive order. And then finally, to round out the major action from the Biden administration, they issued a national security memorandum. This was a requirement in the EO. So the EO said within a year, we'll issue a national security memorandum. Basically just emphasized how national security is very important and directly related to AI, how the US needs to stay an AI leader. So everyone get that down so far? Everyone have that? All right, throw it out. It's worthless. All those things have been rescinded under the Trump administration. So I ran through that quick, but all those things, you don't need to know them. You do for the certification exam. And the reason I still taught you was to show you the different approaches from the different parties on AI regulation. So that was the approach under the Biden administration. We're now going to go through the approach of the Trump administration. So on the very first day in office, President Trump rescinded President Biden's executive order. And he did this not just in an individual capacity. He rescinded, I believe it was over 60 executive orders from Biden on day one with his own executive order, quote, initial rescissions of harmful executive orders and actions. So that AI executive order was rescinded. He called Biden's policy, quote, unnecessarily burdensome requirements for companies developing and deploying AI, and it would stifle and threaten American AI leadership. In its place, 3 days later, President Trump issued a new executive order on AI, removing barriers to American leadership in artificial intelligence. And here are the main components of that. Section 1 kind of outlined this vision that the goal of this executive order is to develop AI systems that are, quote, free from ideological bias and engineered social agendas, and it wanted to maintain the US as an AI global leader. Section 2, the executive order declared that the new policy of the US with respect to AI is to sustain and enhance America's global AI dominance, to promote human flourishing, economic competitiveness, and national security. Section 4, this is one of the more operative aspects and what we should expect to see in the coming months. This established that within 180 days of this executive order, all these different heads of agencies, the president of science and technology, special advisor for AI and crypto, David Sachs, assistant to the president for national security affairs, all of these heads of departments related to AI and technology, they are tasked within 180 days to create a new AI action plan, and they're going to submit it to the president. So that would bring us to July 22nd, 2025. So by then, we should expect to see Trump's more holistic AI action plan to replace the Biden approach. I would personally expect not much regulation. I would expect potentially, I don't know if it would go this far, but try to preempt the field of state regulation, issue an executive order that could preempt state regulation to really deregulate the entire US economy, not only at the federal level, but state level. It'll be interesting to see how those preemption issues play out, but I do not expect any proactive regulation of the private sector. It'll be much more deregulated approach. In Section 5 of this executive order from Trump, it actually directed the heads of those different departments to review all of the actions, directives, orders that came out of the Biden executive order and then immediately rescind them or push them for review if they cannot get immediately rescinded. So basically everything that was done in the executive order from President Biden is now being rescinded, has already been rescinded, or is being actively rescinded right now. The Trump administration and AI, we're going to continue through. There's been more action taken, some of it regulatory, others just more symbolic and representing the continued development of AI in this new administration. So on February 6, 2025, the Trump administration issued a request for input in response to this executive order. So this is pretty interesting. It was actually the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, and this is publicly available. You could actually submit a comment. So basically this executive order said, let's create this action plan by July, and the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy said, in order to create that plan, we're going to go solicit input from the public. So anyone could put any submission they want by March 15th. So if you want to write something up and go submit it, you literally just email it to this email, put that in the subject line, and then you've made a submission to help influence the AI action plan. And it's made calls specifically to academia, industry groups, private sector, state, local tribes, but it could be anyone in the public. What'll be really interesting is when this does close, it's expected that all the suggestions will be public. So it'll be really cool to see how different entities are trying to influence AI regulation and the different perspectives that they have. I put up here in the corner, this is the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy issued this. Technically, it's this subdivision called, if you want to impress your friends, it's called the Networking and Information Technology Research and Development National Coordination Office, National Science Foundation. To be more accurate, just memorize that. Okay, so that was the executive order from Trump. 180 days, we should expect some AI action plan. We'll see what that contains. In the meantime, there's been other developments in the Trump administration. You may have seen this press conference from about 3 weeks ago. There was an announcement of a Stargate project, which brought together OpenAI, Oracle, MGX, and SoftBank. These are all the major players, and the goal of this is a $500 billion investment in AI infrastructure, basically to create these new data centers, and the data centers would then power the next generation of large language models, which are going to need a lot more energy. And there's a 4-year plan. Here are the parties. You have SoftBank and MGX. SoftBank is a Japanese multinational holding company and investment company. MGX is based out of the United Arab Emirates. It's their sovereign wealth fund. So they're providing the financial backing for this project. You have Oracle. They're building the data centers. That's what they do best. Those will be housed in the US. And OpenAI, they're building these large language models and use the data centers as the compute power to create these large language models. So those are all the major players. That's why those people were there and why they're part of the project. And the goal of this project is build new data centers. One's underway in Texas already. They're trying to build 5 to 10 more. They're going to generate over 100,000 jobs, and they're going to broaden. The broader goal is to keep the US as the leader in AI development. And this gets to data centers. I keep talking about data centers. You're going to keep hearing about data centers in the news because they're very important. This is a necessary physical infrastructure and resources to build, train, and operate these large language models. And they require a lot of energy for the reasons we already talked about. the intense compute power to just get responses and train these huge models. So these data centers, a lot of them are built in the middle of nowhere, huge warehouses. You'll see in a video shortly. They house the hardware, which is GPUs, graphic processing units. They house basically the computers, is the best way to think about it, that power these. So I'm going to jump right to a video. This shows you what a data center looks like. There's a little data, it's from COVID, but it still gives you the concept of what these AI data centers look like.
The view may be generic, but this is actually one of my favorite places in the world. Why? Well, I think it represents the most important infrastructure of the 21st century. There are more than 20 buildings, each large enough to house 2 commercial aircraft. They fill 2 million square feet. They're spread out over 300 acres. But what's really interesting is what's inside. It's something that almost no one ever gets to go see. But come with me. It's COVID times. I need to wear my mask, but I'll show you around. Well, as we walk around, first, I've just spared you not just a metal detector, but what is probably the longest and most substantial security checkpoint you'll ever find on planet Earth. But what is so interesting to me is what you see here. This is just a glimpse of the types of server computers that we find in room after room and building after building on these campuses. There are almost 500,000.
All right, it's not that exciting. But you get the point. A bunch of computers in these huge buildings and warehouses, and they're very important for fueling and powering these large language models. So let's see if this works. Okay, cool. And this is to show you what a GPU, we keep talking about it, graphics processing unit, this is what it looks like. This is a computer, some fans on it. And this just goes to show you how important GPUs are to the actual development of large language models. And these AI companies are basically buying them and hoarding them. Anyone know the relevance of NVIDIA to GPUs? Anyone want to raise their hand and explain? So the relevance, everyone's probably heard of NVIDIA at this point in time. Stock is absolutely skyrocketed. They build these GPUs. So GPUs used to be built for video gaming, because you can think video games have all these graphics and a lot of things going on at the same time. So it's to process a lot of data simultaneously. People then realize, oh wow, we could use GPUs for LLMs, because we also need to process all this information at the same time. NVIDIA is now building large language models that are more specific to NVIDIA is building new GPUs called TPUs, tensor processing units, that are more specific for AI development. So that's why NVIDIA's stock has skyrocketed. The discovery that these things they were making for a long time can now be used in this AI space. Everyone's integrating AI, so they have a lot of customers, and people are basically just hoarding Meta, xAI, Tesla even, they're just buying all these GPUs up so that they use them in the future. Thanks. Okay, so data centers. Why did I talk about them? Because that's a big part of this Stargate project. They're building data centers, 5 to 10 of them, possible sites, could be right here. Ohio, Oregon, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania. You get to read the rest. These are all the eligible states that have been announced as sites of possible data centers for development. And fun fact, Ohio really likes data centers. So Amazon has already invested $10 billion in data center infrastructure to date. And you guys just love data centers. So it's really possible that you could have one of the Stargate project data centers in Ohio. And it's been debated whether it actually creates jobs or not. The goal of Stargate, 100,000 jobs, but one of the arguments is it creates a lot of jobs when you're building the data center, but once you're done building it, not many jobs to keep a data center going. So there's that ongoing conflict there. So we've now talked about big bets on infrastructure, $500 billion in the next 4 years. The US has poured money into AI, mostly through Google, Amazon, through OpenAI. So ChatGPT to train its most recent model, $100 million. Now we're investing $500 billion more versus DeepSeek, which has allegedly cost just $6 million. So this is kind of the crux of this DeepSeek market crash per se. Led to about a $1 trillion sell-off 2 weeks ago because this company, DeepSeek, based in China, released 2 models. First, the V3. They released it around Christmas. Didn't get a lot of buzz. Then they released R1 I believe it was on or the day before the inauguration of Trump. I think it's pretty strategic. And they announced this R1 model. It performed almost as well as the O1 model from ChatGPT. So you have ChatGPT, $100 billion to train, $100 million to train. They're pouring in $500 billion in a Stargate announcement. And then you have this company based in China, supposedly a startup, 1.5 years old, and they did this all for $6 million. So you can understand why the market tanked, pouring all this money to do all this great development. Someone else did it, same performance for $6 million. Everyone's saying, do we just waste our investment? What's the future? The other claim was DeepSeek allegedly had older versions of GPUs that run slower, less efficiently. So the other argument is you're pouring all this money into NVIDIA, buying all these GPUs, is that a waste of money? So NVIDIA's stock tanked because there's now this other comparison to say you don't need modern GPUs to build a great large language model. You could use older versions. And then it was open source, so there's some value add to that. It's only kind of open source. There's this MIT licensing thing that validates if you're open source or not. Because it's not available to download in all respects, it's only kind of considered open source. But these were the claims out of the gate, led to a huge market meltdown, over $1 trillion. Since then, the hype has really subsided. There's an independent analysis from this company called SemiAnalysis. They say it actually took $1.6 billion to develop this when you take into account all the hardware, all the training, everything else. So that's obviously a huge difference from $6 million. OpenAI then also immediately launched O3, so they're now back ahead of DeepSeek's R1. So technologically, they're now ahead. And the reason why China was not able to get, why DeepSeek was not able to get these modern GPUs allegedly is because of the export controls I mentioned. There's restrictions on what GPUs NVIDIA and other companies can send to China. So there was this presumption that export controls are no longer working if China is able to circumvent them to get GPUs, or if they're able to use old GPUs and optimize them for just the same performance and LLM capabilities. So those were some of the arguments, but now DeepSeek's behind. A lot of these export controls have not even gone into effect yet from the Biden administration, and they're still planning to go into effect. We'll see if the Trump administration actually enforces them. But the point is, export controls, too early to tell if they've actually worked or not. We should see a slowdown in DeepSeek's future model development if the export controls are actually working and they have less access to more modern GPUs. Also, pretty right away, DeepSeek got banned government use cases in Italy, Australia, Texas banned it on government devices. You also have NASA banned it, the Pentagon, the Navy, and there's even a bill to ban it on US government devices, which I would expect to pass. So even if one of these Chinese-based models gets popular enough, I'd expect it to just get banned by most of the Western countries. So I do not think China could be a real player. It's my personal opinion. DeepSeek was super overhyped. I bought the dip in NVIDIA, so proof. But anyway, I do think it's overhyped. It'll be this continuing conversation, and you could also see how it could be potentially used as another wedge in the argument between the US and China. You keep saying, oh, DeepSeek's his main competitor in order to advance other regulation that may be in the national security interest. So it's something we're going to keep hearing about in politics, even if it can't truly be a competitor and player. Yeah. Yeah. You beat me to it. Damn. Do you want to switch? You teach the rest. There's 20 minutes left. But no, it's a great question. So do you want to explain the irony? You could explain this point. Explain the irony in OpenAI saying that. So you raise a really good point. So I don't know. No, we'll let you cook. Go ahead. Okay, so you raise a good point. So after all this hype of DeepSeek, OpenAI came in and said, oh, by the way, we think DeepSeek copied our model. And the term for it is model distillation. It's when you have one big model, like Gemini, like OpenAI's ChatGPT, and these smaller models just use the output from those models to train their own model. It's basically just using their data to make a smaller model. So there are claims by OpenAI that there was model distillation going on, basically copying it. So it's a great point, and PowerPoint issues. Okay, so we're back on. And the irony I was getting at is, remember, OpenAI is being sued by the New York Times for infringing their copyright, but now OpenAI is unhappy that DeepSeek's copying theirs, and kind of funny. But anyway, and the other concern, data privacy and security. I showed you the terms and conditions. all the data you put in goes to China. You don't know how it's going to be used by the government possibly there. So that's also a big thing that's going to slow down DeepSeek adoption among businesses and even for personal use. President Trump on DeepSeek, he called it a wake-up call. This was like the day that it launched. So he called it this wake-up call for the industry. Elon Musk, who's an AI advisor to President Trump, he said there's no way that he's going to take DeepSeek's claims at face value. One of the big ironies in all this, DeepSeek just claimed all this stuff, 6 mil, no GPUs that are advanced, and everyone just believed it, and it led to a market meltdown. So we very quickly saw after that's not the case. He even said that they lied about using these older H100s from NVIDIA. So there wasn't that strong of a reaction from the executive branch in response to this. But there's one bill I'll mention. Senator Hawley from Missouri, a Republican, he introduced this bill, Decoupling America's Artificial Intelligence Capabilities from China Act. Basically, it would ban the import or export of generative AI technologies. You literally go to jail if you were to download DeepSeek, according to this bill. So it's very kind of going all out and prohibiting engagement with China in terms of AI, but no one's co-sponsored this. This probably won't actually come to fruition, but I'll mention it. And in an interesting show of bipartisanship, Elizabeth Warren, Democrat from Massachusetts, she jointly wrote a letter to Howard Lutnick, who is President Trump's nominee for Commerce Secretary, saying they want to update and enforce export controls. And I mentioned those export controls issued under the Biden administration. A lot of them have not yet gone into effect. They're still pending and valid, so we'll see if there's enforcement. I would expect enforcement of export controls under the Trump administration to slow down China's access to GPUs, which slows down access to their development of more advanced large language models. All right, so that closes out federal regulation from Congress, which we have nothing. We have the White House, which we had the Biden administration, and now a totally different approach from the Trump administration, which is investment dereg, 180 days, we'll have an AI action plan. So mark your calendars. I know you're all waiting for it. And now we're going to shift to, very briefly, because of time, executive agency action on AI. So we're going to run through some of the federal agencies that have actually taken action here. I'll jump right into it. We're going to do the FTC. This is the Federal Trade Commission. They enforce antitrust law, and they enforce consumer protection law. So they've come out and said, under the previous FTC chair, Lina Khan, who's pretty heavy on enforcement, she came out and said, AI is not exempt from the laws on the books. It's not this special thing. So if you're going to go deceive consumers, they're going to take enforcement action against you, whether you use AI or not. So the FTC did not see the need to introduce new laws that are AI specific. They could existing consumer protection law to protect people against misleading uses of AI in business. I'll note there's now a transition in the FTC leadership, so we may see a new direction. Andrew Ferguson, as of January 20th, he's the new FTC chairman. There's really not been any activity out of the FTC since, so all we can do is kind of conjecture based on his past action what we should expect, and I'll get into that. But first, I want to talk about what the FTC has done over the past 2 years. They issued this Operation AI Comply back in September, where they basically said, we're going to target companies using AI to promote unfair practices and to protect consumers. So they've been very active in this space. They've announced enforcement against over a dozen AI companies to date. And I'll show you one that I find very funny. This is a company called Do Not Pay. Anyone heard of Do Not Pay? All right, we got one. So it's this company that promises to be the world's first robot lawyer. It said, like, you could file a lawsuit, you could argue for you in court, you could do all this stuff representing you. They said, quote, owe anyone more than $500, Do Not Pay allows you to generate demand letters, court filings, and even a script to read in court to get your money back. So they really hyped themselves up. And you could already think, like, unauthorized practice of law issues, these are false claims, there's no way. We see these Gen AI tools that are actually been around for a while, they're not even that good, they can't do this. So they got hit by the FTC. And also the California bar as well. They went after them, cease and desist letter for unauthorized practice of law. So this Do Not Pay, this company about not paying, had to settle with the FTC, and they had to pay $193,000. I think they're still in business, but they were forced to retract all these claims of robot lawyer, we could do this, we could do that, because it's not because they used AI, it's because they used AI claims in a deceptive way. So the FTC brought enforcement for that reason. And what to expect now? I'd expect a continuation of this enforcement action against any company that uses AI in a deceptive way. because using deceptive practices is something that has led to action from the FTC, even pre-AI. So there's no distinction if I'm AI or not AI. It doesn't matter. The FTC is approaching it the same way. What should we expect under the new chairman of the FTC? Andrew Ferguson. He's been more critical of AI regulation, and the FTC previously advocated for comprehensive AI regulation, but he was against that. And he's expressed a resistance to AI. The FTC also referred Snap AI. If you have Snapchat, there's that AI feature. The FTC referred it to the DOJ for further investigation and proceedings. He was against that. So he's taken this approach of deregulation, and we should expect that under the Trump administration that the FTC will be similar in that regard, not issuing any new AI-specific regulations. We're now going to go to the FCC, Federal Communications Commission, independent agency that regulates TV, radio, satellite. Interestingly, this does not cover streaming services. So streaming services falls outside the purview of the FCC. I advise a client on an AI regulation related to it. That's how I know that. So in 2024 of July, just this past year, the FCC announced this proposal that would require AI disclosures in political ads on TV and radio. And it would not prohibit the use of AI, it just requires that extra disclosure. And you can imagine, you see those paid for by so-and-so's political campaign, it would be something similar to that. And the requirement would be you put AI-generated content in there, and you'd include information in their political files. The companies, the broadcasters would have to put it in these files, noting that it was AI-generated. Ultimately, public comment was held before the election. There was a lot of pressure on the FCC to pass this because, again, remember that Biden deepfake? That was May 2024. That led to enforcement action by the Federal Election Commission. But then the FCC was heavily pressured to prevent AI-generated deepfakes in the run-up to the 2024 election. So they had a lot of pressure, issued this regulation pretty quick in July, held public comment in September. Ultimately, no action was taken. And one quick detour, all it requires is AI-generated content to be labeled on the ad. Doesn't seem like a big deal. Why do you think a lot of people in politics were against this? Anyone have, no? So, like I mentioned, I advised, it's the National Association of Political Campaign Advisors, bipartisan organization. I represented them and helped wrote their comment during the comment period. They, bipartisan, were against this because, one, this cuts into airtime. So having to put in AI-generated content, and you have to read it, the audio out, cuts into about 1 or 2 seconds, that cuts out of time. 2, it decredits your entire ad. If you have to put AI-generated content just because you use an airbrush to change someone's complexion, that now questions from the consumer perspective, the voter, you now question everything in the ad. So it delegitimizes what you're doing. And then 3, if I were to edit a commercial using like Canva or Adobe that has no Gen AI feature, I could totally make a deepfake doing that. So why should this be regulated when I use Gen AI to do a deepfake versus if I did it in another way, not using Gen AI? So there's all these issues that raise. You would think, oh, this is such a great regulation, so simple, but there are countervailing considerations on this from those being regulated in that space. Do not expect us to go into final rule status because the new FCC commissioner, he was actually against that rule. So I'd say almost no way that's going to reach a final rule. Also in 2024, the FCC, they proposed new regulations on AI-generated robocalls and robotexts. So if you get a robocall or robotext, it would have to be disclosed to you that AI is being used to send that or make that call. Those are the requirements there. It also asks for a definition. They weren't even sure yet what the definition of AI-generated call would entail. And they would have put carve-outs for people using these for disability purposes. If you have a speech issue, you could call people and still use AI to emote to the other person on the other side. So this one is probably the only one I'd say that could possibly reach final rule status. The new chairman of the FCC is Brendan Carr. He was in favor of this rule. So we could possibly see a rule that requires disclosure anytime someone does a robocall or robotext. So this is something to watch for as we progress. It was put through the comment period. It's still pending, so we'll see what happens under the new FCC chairman. Final one I'll cover in the agency land is the FEC, Federal Election Commission. They enforce election law, campaign finance law. It's a committee of 6, broken up into 3 and 3, Republicans and Democrats. They voted not to pursue rulemaking for the use of deceptive AI in campaign ads. What happened was there was this third party you could petition the FEC to issue a new rule, and that's what a third party did. And the committee, the FEC, decided not to pursue that. And the rationale was they already have laws in the books against fraudulent fraudulence, also deception using campaign ads. So they essentially said, whether you're using AI to make a deceptive ad or not using AI, but still make a deceptive ad, doesn't matter. Both of them are covered. Our existing laws in the Federal Election Campaign Act, they are, quote, technology neutral. So you can see this trend from the FTC, FCC, FEC, where they're just applying existing rules. They don't necessarily need new regulations to regulate the use of AI if you're doing it in a deceptive way. With the caveat of the robotext, robocalls, we may see some regulatory action there. So that is a wrap on federal approaches to AI, more specifically, the executive action taken by the FTC, FCC, FEC. And I'm going to jump over to the state regulations in the last 10 minutes that we have. There's a lot more excitement there. Okay, so for state trends, this is a little map of AI state legislation tracking. You can see a lot of these, most of these states have not had anything proposed yet, but some of the trends are at least 45 states have introduced AI bills, and you'll notice that doesn't match up because here, this map shows far more than 45. So this is my flag to you. I've seen so many AI trackers out there. This one's from Husch Blackwell, very well-known law firm, but I've seen different law firms with different AI trackers, and a lot of them differ. So just be careful when you look at them. And the rationale is, how do you define artificial intelligence? Some of these bills will call it automated systems. So some law firms will just search for AI and then consider that an AI bill introduced in the state. Others will do a more in-depth research. So I include both of these here, as well as the sources, so you could check them out. But the best stats I found are from this site down here, National Conference of State Legislators, and they say at least 45 states, plus Puerto Rico, DC, and Virgin Islands, have already introduced AI bills. 31 of the states have already adopted resolutions or actual legislation. And we're going to get into kind of what are the general frameworks and approaches that states are taking. So you can really boil it down to a risk-based approach as well as a targeted domain-specific approach. What I mean by that is, we'll start with the latter, since it's a little simpler. Targeted domain-specific means you're going to pass an AI law that outlaws the use of AI in some niche context. Like, for example, in New York, there's a local law in New York City. You have to inform candidates if you're going to use AI in the decision-making process for hiring. That is domain-specific. That regulates employers, doesn't regulate lawyers, doesn't regulate the medical sector, anything else like that. Domain-specific, very targeted. This is in contrast with risk-based approach. This is more comprehensive in nature. You're essentially looking at all AI systems, categorizing them into different categories based on their risk level, and then you're going to regulate them based on how risky they are. Only one state has taken this approach, and that is Colorado, although that TRIGA bill that I assigned you guys to read, that is another example of a risk-based approach that was introduced in Texas. And where is this inspiration for a risk-based approach coming from? Largely Europe. The EU, the European Union, they passed the first comprehensive risk-based framework, or any AI framework globally. They passed it just this past year. They took this 4-part risk-based framework approach, and you can see the categories here. At the top, unacceptable risk. These are totally prohibited uses of AI, and we'll run through some of them. But right here you have subliminal manipulation, general social scoring. You cannot build these AI systems in the EU, totally banned. Then you have another category, high risk. High risk is the most regulated AI system, and this will include stuff like if AI is part of, in the education process for grading exams even, if it's part of a safety component of a medical device. We'll run through some more of those examples, but that's the second category and the highest regulated, because again, technically, the first category is totally prohibited. Can't even build it. Then you have limited risk. This is a lower level of risk. This would be something like a chatbot they're engaging with on a website. And then finally, you have minimal risk. This is something like a spam filter or spell check, something so simple that probably not going to be regulated in any regard. But we'll go through so you guys can have an understanding, because although this is Europe, and you didn't expect international law in this session, this is inspiring bills like in Colorado, inspiring bills in Texas, some introducing Connecticut and New York as well. So you're going to see a lot of this manifest in the form of regulation in different states. So here's a list of prohibited uses that's that unacceptable risk category. 1, subliminal, manipulative, deceptive techniques to distort behavior and impair formal decision-making, exploiting vulnerabilities due to someone's age, disability, social economic factors, biometric categorization systems, basically capturing people's biometric data, sex, race, beliefs, etc., without them knowing it. Social scoring system, evaluating, classifying people based on social behavior, personal traits. If you and your friends are planning on building this weekend, you got to make other plans. Can't do social scoring. Assessing the risk of an individual committing criminal offenses. This goes into the surveillance aspect, trying to be predictive in terms of what groups may commit crime in certain areas. Compiling facial recognition databases without people's consent from CCTV and the internet. Inferring emotions in the workplace or educational setting. Can't do that. And those are some of the things that are banned under the unacceptable risk category. Some of the issues with this are, how do you define a lot of these categories? Sounds good, sounds like these should be banned, but take for one, deploying subliminal, manipulative, or deceptive tactics to distort behavior, impair informed decision-making, causing significant harm. What if you're in marketing? What if you're in politics? You're trying to persuade behavior, persuade social behavior. What's considered manipulative? What is considered too far? What's considered subliminal marketing? So a lot of these are going to be very difficult to actually define and apply in practice, and only parts of the EU AI Act have gone into effect, this prohibited category being one of them, but we'll see how it plays out because it's spanned out over the next, I believe, 2 years, all aspects of the EU AI Act. So now going over to some of the high-risk categories. High risk, according to the EU AI Act, that category includes AI systems intended to be used as a safety component of a product. What I mean by that is like a medical device that's AI powered. So if someone has a medical device that they use maybe for their heart palpitations or something like that, if you're integrating AI into that already existing safety product, that AI is considered high risk because it could cause significant harm to that person. Other examples, AI in vehicles, scoring of exams in an education setting. That's more so because of discrimination and bias concerns, but that seems like a pretty mundane use of AI that's now exposed to high risk category regulation. Resume screening software and employment, again, due to bias concerns. And then finally, AI tools used for court filings and used in the court system. That is considered high risk. It'll be very interesting to see how that now affects all these big tech companies that are operating in Europe. And here is the correlating regulation. So we know these categories that are exposed to this high risk category and are labeled as such. Now the question is, so how do they get regulated? So anything that falls in that category, they have a lot of risk assessment and mitigation systems that they have to put into place. They have to actually be able to prove that they have high quality data sets that are representative of the demographic that they're actually serving. They have to log activity of results in their chatbots. They have to clear and provide adequate information to deployers. That's people that actually put the AI into the market. And they have to have a lot of security features and human oversight. So there's a lot of requirements. And you can imagine if you're a startup, early stage company, bootstrap company, you have to have people doing human oversight. You have to add in extra compute power to log everything you do. We already learned about the black box nature of these LLMs. So you have to track the decision-making process. Technologically, that will be very difficult. So these are some of the criticisms of the EU AI Act that have been made so far. So that's an overview. This is now coming into kind of existence in the US. TRIG is an example. They only create a high-risk category and prohibited use. But I want to run through one example to close out in the next 3 minutes. So they classify AI based on perceived risk, similar to the EU AI Act. They define a high-risk AI system as any AI system as a substantial factor to a consequential decision. And now stick with me. So this is a definition of high-risk AI system. And then we get a definition of substantial factor. It's a factor that is considered when making a consequential decision, likely to alter the outcome of a consequential decision and weighed more heavily than the other factor contributing to a consequential decision. And then we have a definition of consequential decision. So if you read it all together, high-risk AI system is any AI system that is a factor that is considered when making a consequential decision to a consequential decision. That's how this is drafted. So drafting-wise, it makes no sense. And I think this just demonstrates the complexity of this area of law, and even just drafting and figuring out how to regulate this area is a very difficult task. Plus, defining artificial intelligence has also proven to be a difficult thing. Definitions vary across government agencies, across different states. So being able to even identify the technology and describe it in law has proven to be a challenge. I do not expect this bill to pass in Texas. They're very ahead on pro-business, anti-regulation. I'd be very surprised to see if this were actually to go into effect. So we'll end on the last 2 minutes with a question. Should we ban AI technologies right now? Texas Act creates this prohibited category. EU prohibits AI in certain use cases. Should we be banning any AI technologies right now? The quicker you answer, the quicker you get to leave. All right, I'm going to take one no, one yes. Who wants to be the brave soul to say yes? All right, in the back. You should have raised your hand then.
Oh, it's like a whole, this is a disaster. Okay. Look, I just raised my hand for the bit. I didn't have many thoughts, I'll be perfectly honest.
All right, you want to ban AI. There's a very strong argument. Anyone not want to ban it? There's not much to rebut, so the field is yours. All right, this will close out the class. Last comment on why we should not ban AI technologies. All right, go ahead. Good answer. My answer is TBD. Maybe I'll tell you my thoughts next year. Thank you so much for the class. Really appreciate it, guys.
Really fast before you guys leave, make sure you throw away your boxes. Clean up like around yourselves. Evan said that you should feel free to connect with him on LinkedIn if you want to do that. So you can find him on LinkedIn. Have a wonderful weekend.
Thank you.